Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for that very kind introduction. So I'm very excited to tell you all about some research I've been doing with a program called Seeds of Peace. And this is such an interesting interdisciplinary group. I'll be excited to hear about your questions and your thoughts about this research after I'm done talking about it. So when I first started conducting this research, I conducted some structured interviews with Jewish, Israeli, and Palestinian teenagers that attend this camp. And one of the questions that I asked these teenagers was, how would you define a peaceful utopia? And I'll never forget this answer that a Jewish Israeli teenager gave me. She thought for a few minutes, and then she said, I would define it as a place without terrorism or fear, where soldiers at checkpoints wouldn't have to worry. And so what I thought was amazing about this quote is that even in utopia, she can't imagine a world that doesn't have checkpoints and that doesn't have soldiers. That world just doesn't exist for her. And sadly, I don't think that she's unique at all in that regard. Millions of people like her in the Middle East, conflict is just a way of life for them. So let me tell you a little bit about this program, Seeds of Peace. I've been working with them for about 5 years with my collaborator, Jane Risen. It's one of the largest Middle East coexistence programs, depending on how you define the size of the program. They have about 5,000 graduates at this point, and about 15% of them have gone into peace as their career, essentially. And what's interesting about this program is that the 13 to 17-year-old teenagers, Jewish Israelis and Palestinians, as well as other teenagers in the Middle East and even in South Asia, they've expanded sort of their conflict regions. They're selected not based on their proclivity to peace, but they're actually selected based on their leadership potential and their English-speaking ability. And so the program is predicated on the idea that by bringing a small number of people into this camp, these young teenagers, at a time in their lives when they're sort of malleable and you could potentially affect change in terms of their attitudes about peace and their attitudes about the other side of their conflict, then maybe they'll grow up to be leaders and they'll sort of spread this change. And so we've been evaluating this. And what's also interesting about this program is that they use what's called a neutral setting model. And what this means is that they actually fly the teenagers from their home countries to the United States. Specifically, they go to this very secluded area in Maine, USA. This is an actual photo from the camp. For a 3-week camp program. So they fly them from their respective countries and then back. So they spend 3 weeks together interacting, having this in-person contact experience at this camp in Maine. And the program was founded by John Wallach, this man right here. He's a US journalist. And his advice that he would always give to the campers all the time was to simply make one friend. So he would go around telling the campers that they needed to make one friend from the other side of the conflict, and that was sort of the purpose of the camp. And so it was never really scientifically evaluated what was the wisdom of this advice. And so that was part of the program of research that I was trying to do. What does making one friend actually do? Is this advice wise? What are the impacts of making one friend? Can we evaluate that? So let me formalize some of the research questions that I had when I was starting to do work with this program. So the first big research question is, can contact, intergroup contact, longitudinally predict attitude change among Jewish Israelis and Palestinians specifically? So even though we have data on all of the different Middle East delegations that attended this camp, the Jewish Israelis and the Palestinians are the largest 2 nationalities. And so I'll focus all of my analyses today on those 2 groups. And then second, really importantly, will this intervention's effects, if there are any, remain after the participants return to their respective home countries in the conflict region? And this has been colloquially referred to as the reentry problem, which is that maybe they have this contact experience and it starts to change some of their attitudes, but as soon as they go back to their home countries, maybe that any attitude change just disappears or regresses. So I'll examine this reentry problem as well. So all of this research is predicated on the very important theory in the literature, in the psychology literature, called intergroup contact theory. It was developed by Gordon Allport in 1954, and it simply suggests that if two different groups that are in conflict can make contact at some level, that this will then start to change their attitudes more positively towards the conflict, towards each other. And it also suggests that basically attitudes will generalize. So even if I meet with just one member from the other side of a conflict and I start to change my opinions about that one person, that might generalize to the entire group. And this theory has been tested very extensively in over 5,000 studies according to a relatively recent meta-analysis. And it suggested that there are these 4 optimal conditions. They're not necessary, but they help to make the contact experience better. And these conditions were that there needed to be equal status between the groups as much as possible. There needed to be common goals among the groups, that there needed to be some level of intergroup cooperation, and that the authorities in the program supported this contact experience. And a fifth condition has actually been added to this since the original theory, and this is the condition that I call friendship potential, which is that there needs to be some potential to actually make a friend with someone from the other side of the conflict. And so this isn't minor at all, right? If you think about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's very, very difficult potentially to meet these conditions, right? There's necessarily may not feel like there's equal status among the groups. And so, for example, the fact that there's support of the authorities, can there be friendship potential? These are very, very hard conditions potentially to meet in that conflict. But Seeds of Peace, this camp, was built in order to try to meet each of these 5 different conditions. And so you might be wondering, actually, if there are over 5,000 studies that have tested intergroup contact theory, why we need another one. But in fact, most of these studies have been done with convenient samples that are cross-sectional in nature, which means the studies occur at the same time. So they're just correlational. They look at whether contact is correlated with attitudes at one particular point in time. So there's been a really big call in the literature for there to be more longitudinal designs that involve more antagonistic groups. So not just these convenient samples, but actually looking at real conflict rooted in history, like the Middle Eastern conflict, and looking at it longitudinally across time to see if effects of contact can last throughout time. So that's what we're going to do here. And another very interesting theoretical point on neutral setting interventions is that they kind of pit the friendship potential condition against the reentry problem. And so here's what I mean by this, which is that there is no potential for, very, very little potential for Israelis, Jewish Israelis and Palestinians to actually make friends in their conflict regions. They can't even really get in contact very well, maybe across online interfaces. But it's very hard for them to have in-person contact experiences, and the constant peer pressure and the context of their conflict makes it very difficult for real friendships to be formed. And so by taking them and moving them into this neutral setting, into this relatively neutral setting of America, they are trying to allow for friendship potential to exist. And so on the one hand, you have people who say the contact situation, whatever it is, it must provide participants with the opportunity to become friends, which suggests that you might need a neutral setting intervention. And then on the other hand, you have the reentry problem, which is when you have these neutral setting encounters, they rely, this is a critic of the neutral setting encounters, they rely on the creation of these artificial mediated settings that are completely detached from the actual conflict context, and therefore any effect of the encounter will be erased upon participants' inevitable return to reality. So you have the reentry problem pitted against the importance of maybe friendship potential. So here's how we evaluated the campers' attitudes in this organization. We did it through survey data, actually. So campers received surveys that look sort of like these, but they were 13 pages long, and we gave them surveys at different time points, and we've done it for 5 years now, from 2010 to 2014, and we'll be doing it again this summer. And we gave them surveys at 3 different time points. So on the first day of camp, as soon as the campers arrive, as soon as they get off the buses, they're carted into a cafeteria area and they're given the first set of surveys. We call them the pre-camp surveys. So they haven't even really started the camp experience, but they're there. And then 3 weeks later, after the camp is over, we give them the post-camp survey. So on the very last day of camp, right before they go, they get a survey with the same kind of questions so that we can compare from point 1 to point 2. And then finally, this is really important, 6 to 9 months after camp has ended, we give them a follow-up survey. And so we don't have follow-up survey data for every single year, but I'll show you all the years that we do have, bless you. I'll show you all the years that we do have this data for. And so this will allow us to address that re-entry problem. What happens after they re-enter their home countries? And so let me give you a little insight into the type of questions we asked these participants. So one set of questions was all about measuring attitudes towards the other side of the conflict. I'm going to call that the outgroup. So we asked them questions like, how positively do you feel towards the Jewish Israelis, for example? How close do you feel? How similar do you feel? How much do you trust the other side? We also asked them questions that were supposed to measure humanization. These are all from well-validated scales in the literature. So these are questions like, how much do you agree with the Jewish Israelis are rational and logical, for instance? And then we gave them some questions measuring empathy towards the other side. So a question like this would be, if a person from the other side was being treated unfairly, I would feel angry about the way they were being treated. And then we averaged all of these items to form an index of the overall positivity of attitudes towards the other side of the conflict. And then we also measured the extent to which people made friends with someone from the other side. So we never used the word friendship in any of the surveys because there's a lot of reactance to this word. And we worked carefully with the Seeds of Peace officials in coming up with the language for the surveys. But we simply told participants to think about, at the end of camp, to think about the 5 people to whom they feel most close in the entire camp. So they could easily list people from their own side. So Jewish Israelis could list other Jewish Israelis. But they could list anyone. So they could list an American, they could list a Palestinian. And so we looked to see if anyone in the top 5 people in the entire camp listed people from the other side. Okay, so let me tell you about some of our findings. So our first big question here is really, does having this contact experience, does going to Seeds of Peace for 3 weeks, does that actually improve attitudes measurably towards the other side from pre-camp to post-camp? So this question is really, can we find any measurable benefit of attending the camp? What is the effect of attending camp? The answer is that contact did improve attitudes in all 5 years from pre-camp to post-camp. So let me show you a little bit of data on this. So this is the Jewish Israelis, and here are the Palestinians. And so this is, again, it's an index of how positively they felt towards the other side of the conflict on all of those different constructs I discussed, like how you feel about the other side, how much you humanize them, how much empathy you have towards them. It's a 1 to 7 scale. And so you can see that in every single year, from pre-camp to post-camp, there's a positive trend from the right side of the screen to the left side. And so what's a couple interesting things here. So it's interesting to try to think about what's happening in the different years, because obviously there's changes across the years. I can certainly say that in 2014 there was a conflict going on, as you all know. So there was the Gaza conflict, and at that time people were dying. There were over 2,000 people that died in that conflict, and so the camp was extremely contentious that year. But as you can see, if anything, change was even greater among the Jewish Israelis and just as great among the Palestinians in 2014 compared to all the other years. And then another interesting thing here is that the Palestinians start much more negatively than the Jewish Israelis. So if you just look at the scales here, they're starting about 2 points more negatively on the scale than the Jewish Israelis, but they actually change more, maybe potentially because they start lower on the scale. But both groups, both the nationalities, are showing change, statistically significant change from pre-camp to post-camp. Next, did anyone from the camp list someone from the other side of the conflict as one of those top 5 people to whom they were most close? The answer is yes, they absolutely did. And in fact, I think this is actually incredible. Most of the years, except for in 2013, something strange was happening here, which I can talk about later. More than 50% of the campers actually listed someone from the other side of the conflict as one of their closest friends in the entire camp. Okay, the next question is really, this is John Wallach's make a friend advice, where we're investigating the wisdom of this. Does making a friend, so considering that a lot of people made a friend from the other side, does making this outgroup friend actually predict attitude change? So are the people who make a friend, are they more likely to show more positive attitude change towards the other side from pre-camp to post-camp? And the answer is yes. Again, in every single year that we have data for, 2010, 2011, 2012, and 2014, we found this to be the case. So let me walk you through a simple path model. I'll walk you through this. First of all, we're controlling for nationality here, and this includes Jewish Israelis and Palestinians. First of all, what's the effect of having had any sort of positive relationship with an outgroup member before camp? And it is the case that in all the years that we asked this question, and all of the years that we have data on this, having some sort of relationship with the outgroup before camp leads people to feel more positively inclined towards unsurprisingly, towards the other side before camp. So it's related to the pre-camp positivity. Next, who actually makes a friend at camp? And so we thought potentially that maybe the people that come in, because it's sort of a bidirectional model, the people that come into the camp feeling most positively inclined towards the other side would be the ones who tend to make a friend. That actually wasn't really the case. So in 2011, 2012, you do see a significant relationship such that the people that start by feeling most positively towards the other side are more likely to make a friend. But in 2013, 2014, we didn't really see that relationship. And so I think that this might suggest that sort of the situation of being in the camp might have overridden even people who were sort of negatively inclined, particularly negatively inclined towards the other side, were still making friends potentially. And then here's the really important, what's the effect of having a friend? So controlling for all these other things, controlling for how positively you felt towards the other side before you even started camp, controlling for your relationships before you started camp, controlling for nationality. The people who make a friend at camp, that significantly predicts in every single year how positively they feel towards all of the Seeds of Peace campers from the other side. And then that generalizes to how they feel towards the entire group. So if I am a Jewish Israeli and I made a friend, a Palestinian friend at camp, I now feel more positively inclined towards all the Palestinian Seeds of Peace campers. And not only that, I feel more positively inclined towards Palestinians in general. Now this is the reentry problem question. Did any outgroup positivity remain after reentry? So maybe it's the case that after participants go back to their home countries, so far I've told you a very positive story that going to camp leads to these positive benefits in terms of attitude change towards the other side. A lot of people are making friends with the other side of the conflict. People make friends or even more positive towards the other side. But now what happens after the participants go home? Do we see any remaining positivity? The answer is yes, we do see residual positivity in every single year that we have data. So again, let me show you the data for every single year. So 2011, let me start by saying that we don't have perfect response rate on the follow-up surveys. So we have some selection bias in terms of who's completing the follow-up surveys. In camp, we have perfect response rate. So we can keep all of them in one room and force all of them to do the survey, 100%. But in follow-up surveys, we can't have perfect response rate. We can just ask as many people to do the survey as possible, and we provide lots of incentives to them, like we give out Amazon.com gift cards. So first of all, let me show you the selection bias. So the dotted line shows the people that completed the follow-up, and the solid line shows everyone who did the survey from camp. You can see that there's a little bit of bias here. So the people who completed the follow-up tended to be more positive towards the other side from the very beginning. Which makes sense. The people who are most positive are completing our follow-up surveys. And then we can continue to track these people. And so this is follow-up. So here's the attitude erosion. So from this high of post-camp, so there's an increase from pre-camp to post-camp. And from this high point of positivity in post-camp, there's a decrease. Okay, so attitude erosion exists. This is not not surprising. But we still see some residual positivity. So compared to when participants started the camp, they still feel more positively inclined towards the other side 6 to 9 months out after they return. And we see very similar stories for 2012. So here's the selection bias in this sample that we have. There's the decrease in follow-up. There's some attitude erosion there. And there's still some residual positivity. And then 2013, this was a particularly interesting pattern of results. Even though we had fewer people overall completing the follow-up survey, the ones that completed it were the ones who had to attend some mandatory events. And so we actually have no selection bias. So everyone who completed it weren't different from the people that were at camp in the first place. And furthermore, they actually showed the least attitude erosion and the most residual positivity in 2013. So we can sort of speculate what's going on, what are the differences across the years, but the one thing that we have in common in all these years is that every single year shows a little bit of attitude erosion, but shows some significant residual positivity towards the other side. And then the last question is, do these outgroup friendships that are formed during camp, do they predict positivity towards the other side at follow-up? So is it the case that the people that made a friend by the end of camp also feel most positively inclined towards the other side even 9 months out? So does that relationship really stick? Does that really predict what happens 9 months out? And there's a couple different possibilities here. So one possibility is that, yes, the friend that you make at the end of camp predicts what your attitudes are 9 months out. Another possibility is that it has no predictive power whatsoever, right? It's just a drop in the bucket. You make a friend at camp. It doesn't really predict your attitudes another 9 months out. A third possibility is that some people get a friend at the end of camp and then they lose that friend. So we actually asked them again at the follow-up survey how many friends they had, and so we can track to see if they maintain that friendship. So maybe it's worse to make a friend and then lose that friend than to have never had a friend at all. So that would be the change in friendship predicting. And then the last possibility is that maybe what the friendships that you formed at the end of camp don't matter so much as what are your relationships right then at the follow-up moment. So maybe it's really the relationships that are that people have 9 months out that are really predicting their attitudes. And so here's what we find. Here's what we find. In general, the friends that people made at the end of camp did predict their attitudes 9 months out. But the change in friendship also matters. So the people, for example, that made a friend and then lost it were negative, were more negative than the people, they weren't more negative than the people who had never made a friend, which is nice. But the change in friendship does matter. So we're actually running the 2014 follow-up surveys right now. I think this will give us a little bit more clarity into exactly how those relationships are predicting follow-up attitudes. But right now I can tell you that it does seem like there's some preliminary evidence that the relationships do inform later attitudes, but we're just not sure if sort of how that change in friendship will be most predictive. Okay, so I'm going to sort of distill what we've learned into 3 big points for you. So first of all, I think the biggest thing we've learned across these 5 years is that camp does have an effect on attitudes. A measurable effect that we find from the survey data. So we find dramatic, consistent change in attitudes from pre-camp to post-camp every single year that we have run these surveys. This provides some more support for contact theory. So intergroup contact theory, which has not been tested so much in terms of antagonistic groups with longitudinal designs, we provide more support for it here. Of course, it needs to be a certain type of contact potentially. This is a very positive contact that they create in this camp. And then also we see that attitudes generalize. So an attitude that someone has towards a member of the camp seems to generalize towards an attitude that they have towards the entire group. Okay, second, reentry is a problem, but maybe not such a big one. So this is the reentry that I showed you in all the separate graphs here, such that there is attitude erosion every single year. So it is the case that after camp, when participants go back, their attitudes become more negative again. But the fact that we're seeing residual positivity year after year suggests that maybe this problem isn't so concerning, or maybe it's worth it in light of the benefits that the friendship potential seems to bring to the table. And so that's my last point here, which is about outgroup friendships. And so far, we've looked at many different predictors for attitude change. And the biggest predictor that we found, and this is a predictor we find year over year, is the people that make some sort of relationship with someone from the other side. So it's these outgroup friendships that seem particularly predictive of attitude change, certainly from pre-camp to post-camp, and also seemingly even 9 months out. But again, for the follow-up attitude change, we need to research more to understand exactly what it is about the relationships that are driving that attitude change. But certainly seems to be related. And so in the last couple minutes, I'll just tell you about a few future directions that we're working on right now. So you can feel free to ask me questions about this later. It's very exciting new work. So one is that we want to run some experimental interventions. So even though longitudinal designs are better than cross-sectional designs because you can control for all these different variables that give you a little bit of a better sense of the causal direction of the effects, nothing sort of measures up to the gold standard of an experimental intervention in which you can randomly assign people to be in different conditions so you can see the causal effects of that manipulation. And so what we're trying to convince the camp to do is to let us run some experimental interventions. And the idea here is to leverage what we found so far, which is that the relationships that the campers build really matter. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to run experiments in which we create these friendships a little bit more deliberately. We tried to run an experiment in 2014 camp. It turns out it's very, very hard to create friendships among people in these conflict situations, and so that's something we're working on now. So the experiment won't work unless we actually can manufacture a friendship in some way. That's difficult. Next, we want to have better benchmarks. So we're looking at new comparison groups. We're looking at national samples. We're looking at the applicant pool. So we're starting to follow the applicant pool. People that applied to Seeds of Peace but didn't get accepted, what happens with them? How do their attitudes change? And then, of course, we're really interested in the spread of attitude change. So we've been surveying the siblings of the campers and their parents so that we can see if their attitudes are changing at all as well. So you can imagine that maybe when the campers come back and they're starting to talk about what happened at camp, maybe they're changing the way they dialogue, the way they interface with their friends and their family, then maybe there's some sort of spread happening in attitude change. And certainly that's sort of the model that the entire camp is predicated upon. They can only have a very small number of people attending this camp, so they're hoping that attitude change spreads. So we're trying to look at that. And then also, after we wrote this New York Times article, we got approached by many different organizations that are also trying to run similar types of peace programs. There's an organization called Hands of Peace that's actually located in Chicago and San Francisco. And they use a very, very similar model to Seeds of Peace. And so we're working with them to see if we're finding the exact same kind of predictors there, if relationships really matter in those programs as well. And so that'll help us to really generalize the theory to different types of programs. Thank you so much for having me, and if you want to read up more about this research, you can go to my website and click on research link, and then you can find all the information that you need about it.